It was a dark night, where the moon barely dared to peek through the dark clouds that hovered in the sky. The wind whispered unsettling secrets in the narrow, forgotten streets of a small, decaying city. In the center of this city, there was a street that had long been abandoned, a place where darkness seemed to have a tangible presence. Rua das Sombras, as it was known, was a place that residents avoided at all costs, especially after dark. The worn asphalt, ruined houses, and broken streetlights contributed to the ominous atmosphere that permeated the place. Even the birds seemed to avoid flying over the street, as if they felt the oppression that hovered there. Lucas, a fearless and curious young man, was an exception. He had heard terrifying stories about the Street of Shadows, but his curiosity always overcame his fear. That night, he decided it was time to face his fears and unravel the mysteries surrounding the dark street. With a dim lantern in one hand and a heart full of courage in the other, Lucas began his solitary journey along Rua das Sombras. The first thing he noticed was the sepulchral silence that enveloped the place. There was no sound of traffic, laughter, or voices of children playing. It was as if the street itself was in a state of lethargy, awaiting something terrible. As he walked, he illuminated the ruined buildings with his flashlight. The walls were covered in graffiti, many of them depicting grotesque and unintelligible images. Lucas felt the eyes of the distorted figures watching him as he passed. He knew that the place was frequented by vandals and suspicious people, but there was something more, a supernatural sensation that disturbed him. The few streetlights that still worked cast distorted shadows on the walls of the houses. Sometimes the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, dancing and twisting in unsettling ways. Lucas tried to push these thoughts aside and attribute them to his overactive imagination. But the truth was that the Street of Shadows was beginning to exert its dark influence on him. As he progressed, the sounds of the night became more unsettling. The wind howled between the decrepit buildings, creating a macabre symphony with the creaking of trees and the rustling of dry leaves on the ground. Every step he took echoed like a drum, announcing his presence on that cursed street. It was then that Lucas noticed something disturbing. Stains of a dark, viscous liquid marked the asphalt. He bent down to examine them and realized they were dried blood. There was no logical explanation for that. Who would have shed blood there, and why? As his mind worked to find an answer, he heard a sound coming from one of the abandoned houses to his left. It was as if something or someone was scratching the walls inside the building. His heart sped up, and Lucas shone his flashlight into the house, shining a spotlight on a broken window. It was then that he saw something that made him catch his breath. Inside the house, there was a shadowy figure, tall and thin, with bright, empty eyes. The figure seemed to twitch, as if it was moving abnormally. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape in life. Lucas took a few steps back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The figure inside the house seemed to be approaching the broken window, as if trying to reach him. Its empty eyes stared at Lucas, filling him with a sense of indescribable dread. With his heart hammering in his chest, Lucas could no longer contain himself. He turned and ran down the Street of Shadows, his flashlight swinging frantically in his hand. The sound of his footsteps echoed loudly in the empty street as he desperately tried to escape the shadowy figure chasing him. The figure, however, was not willing to let him get away so easily. With quick, silent movements, she slipped out of the house and began to follow him with supernatural agility. Every time Lucas looked back, he saw the bright, empty eyes getting closer, which drove him to run faster. As he walked down the Street of Shadows, the darkness seemed to close in around him, as if the shadows themselves were conspiring against him. The decrepit houses shortened and tilted, as if to prevent him from escaping. The world around him was distorting, becoming a nightmarish landscape. Lucas knew he was losing the race against the shadowy figure that was chasing him. His breath was running out, and his legs were shaking with exhaustion. He realized that his only hope of survival was to find shelter in one of the abandoned houses that lined the foreboding street. Desperate, he chose a house that looked less dilapidated than the others and threw himself inside. The door creaked open, and he closed it behind him, panting and breaking into a cold sweat. His heart was about to explode, and his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside the house. Lucas knew he couldn't stay there for long. He needed to find a way out, or at least a safe hiding place. Taking a deep breath, he wondered if his reckless actions had led him straight into a nightmare he couldn't escape. As he searched for a way out, little did he know that the real nightmare was about to begin. The shadows in the house began to twist and move, taking on distorted and frightening shapes. Lucas found himself enveloped by a darkness that seemed to have a life of its own, and the fear he had felt in Rua das Sombras was about to reach a new level of horror. Inside the abandoned house, Lucas was surrounded by darkness, with his flickering flashlight as the only source of light. Shadows danced around him, taking on grotesque and indescribable shapes. They seemed to be alive, hungry for his presence. Lucas knew he couldn't stay in that place for long. He raised the flashlight, shining what he could. The room was filled with dusty and broken furniture, and the walls were covered in mold stains. Everything in the house seemed to testify to a past of decay and abandonment. As Lucas progressed through the house, he heard unsettling sounds coming from other rooms. It was as if something or someone was moving inside the building, lurking in the shadows. He kept the flashlight pointed forward, terrified of what he might find. As he explored the dark corridors, Lucas passed half-open doors and forgotten rooms. Each division seemed to hide sinister secrets. Old family portraits covered in dust adorned the walls, depicting sad faces and empty stares, as if those who lived there had carried a dark burden. At the end of a hallway, Lucas came across a door that looked different from the others. It was covered in mysterious inscriptions and strange symbols carved into the wood. It was as if the door was waiting for him, calling him in some way. With a shaking hand, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. It creaked open, revealing an even darker room. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity prompted him to enter. The room was smaller than the others and was plunged into total darkness. Lucas's flashlight illuminated the room, revealing an oppressive interior. The air seemed heavy with the weight of the past, as if the walls had memory. There was a sense of despair in the air, as if the very walls of the room had witnessed unspeakable tragedies. In the center of the room, Lucas saw a dusty blackboard covered in symbols and inscriptions. He moved closer to examine it better, his eyes following the intricate lines and strange characters. It was then that the slate came to life before his eyes. The inscriptions began to move and rearrange themselves, forming images and words. Lucas looked on in amazement as the past of the Street of Shadows was revealed before him. The blackboard showed scenes of tragedy and horror that had occurred on that street. Wandering ghosts, shadowy creatures, and tormented souls roamed the Street of Shadows. Every corner, every stone had a terrible story to tell. The spectral figure that Lucas had seen earlier appeared in the room, hovering over the blackboard. She didn't have empty, threatening eyes this time. Instead, his eyes shone with a deep sadness and eternal melancholy. It was as if she were the keeper of the dark secrets of the Street of Shadows. "You have unlocked our secret," the figure said in an anguished whisper. "The Street of Shadows holds unfathomable secrets. Those who dare uncover them must pay the price." Lucas couldn't look away from the board, from the frightening images that continued to unfold. Every tragedy, every life lost, every scream of pain seemed to echo in his mind. "What do you want from me?" Lucas asked in a shaky voice. The figure extended a spectral hand towards the blackboard. "You must make a choice, curious young man. Join us and bear the eternal burden of the Street of Shadows, or try to escape and face a fate worse than death." Lucas was torn, his heart heavy with the responsibility of his decision. He looked at the images on the board and thought of the tormented souls that roamed the Street of Shadows, thirsting for redemption. With determination, he reached out towards the spectral figure. "I choose to face the burden of the Street of Shadows. Perhaps, one day, we will find peace for the tormented souls that inhabit this place." The figure nodded sadly, as if approving of Lucas's decision. The inscriptions on the board began to dissipate, the images gradually disappearing. The figure faded, disappearing into the darkness. Lucas found himself alone in the dark room, surrounded by silence. He knew he had accepted a dark fate, but he was determined to face it with courage and compassion. The Street of Shadows held unfathomable secrets, and Lucas was willing to reveal them, even if it meant carrying the eternal burden that fell on that cursed place. After his decision to face the burden of the Street of Shadows, Lucas left the dark room and explored the abandoned house in search of more clues as to what awaited him. Every corner of the place was permeated with an oppressive atmosphere, as if the walls held dark memories. While investigating, Lucas noticed a door that appeared to lead to a basement. The door was ajar, revealing an even deeper darkness below. His curiosity compelled him to go down and discover what else the Rua das Sombras held. The staircase leading to the basement creaked with each step he descended, as if the house itself were alive and reacting to his presence. The dim light of his flashlight illuminated the path, revealing a space that seemed unexplored for years. In the basement, Lucas found a room with walls covered in old photographs and dusty documents. The portraits portrayed past generations of residents of Rua das Sombras, their faces marked by sadness and despair. The documents appeared to be records of events that had occurred on that street, and as Lucas examined them, he began to understand the truth behind the dark secret of the Street of Shadows. The street had a history that went back decades. Every generation, a member of the family that lived in the house where Lucas found himself was chosen to face a dark fate. They were the guardians of the Street of Shadows, charged with keeping the street's secrets safe from the world. Lucas realized that the spectral figure he had encountered was one of the tormented souls of these guardians. She had been consumed by the darkness of the street and now wandered eternally, carrying the burden of keeping the Street of Shadows secret. The young man looked at the documents and realized that the last guardian of the street was someone from his own family, his grandfather. He saw his grandfather's name in one of the records, accompanied by a date that coincided with the time his grandfather had mysteriously disappeared. Lucas felt a mix of emotions: shock, sadness, and renewed determination. He knew that the only way to help his grandfather and the tormented souls of the Street of Shadows was to continue the search for the truth and face the dark secret that was plaguing the place. Determined to solve the mystery and find his grandfather, Lucas returned to the upstairs of the abandoned house and prepared to leave it. However, before leaving, he noticed a dusty diary on a shelf. Curious, he picked it up and started leafing through it. The diary belonged to his grandfather and contained detailed notes about the experiences of the former guardian of the Street of Shadows. His grandfather described encounters with shadowy figures, terrifying visions, and the constant feeling that something was watching him. One page in particular caught Lucas's attention. His grandfather had written about a portal to another dimension that was found on the Street of Shadows. The portal was the source of all the evil that plagued the place, and only the street guardian could keep it sealed. With renewed determination, Lucas realized that the only way to help his grandfather and free the tormented souls of the Street of Shadows was to find the portal and seal it once and for all. He knew the task would be dangerous and challenging, but he was willing to face the unknown in the name of justice and redemption. Before leaving the abandoned house, Lucas put away his grandfather's diary and prepared to continue his journey. He had a mission, and there was no time to waste. Upon returning to the Street of Shadows, he could feel that the place was darker and more oppressive than ever. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe, as if they were aware of his presence and his mission. The wind howled between the buildings in a ghostly chorus, as if trying to dissuade him from his path. Lucas was determined to find the portal and seal it, no matter how daunting the challenge might be. He knew that the Street of Shadows held unfathomable secrets, and he was determined to uncover them, even if it meant facing the very horror that the street represented. Lucas was determined to face the challenge of finding the portal that kept Rua das Sombras trapped in its eternal darkness. Holding tight to his flashlight and his grandfather's diary, he made his way through the narrow, foreboding streets, looking for any clue that would lead him to the portal. The shadows seemed to close around him, as if the street itself was aware of his mission and was trying to stop him. Broken streetlights cast distorted shadows that seemed to move like living entities, whispering indescribable secrets. After hours of tireless searching, Lucas finally found a house that seemed to be the epicenter of darkness. It was an ancient and imposing building, with an aura of malevolence that made his skin crawl. The walls of the house were covered in cracks and mysterious inscriptions, and the garden before it was filled with twisted, dead trees. Lucas approached the house with a sense of determination mixed with apprehension. He consulted his grandfather's diary, which contained a detailed map of the Street of Shadows, indicating that the portal was inside the mysterious house. With a deep sigh, Lucas pushed the door of the house, which opened with a frightening creak. He walked in and immediately felt a change in the atmosphere. The darkness inside the house seemed even denser and more threatening than that on the street. As he explored the inside of the house, Lucas found a staircase that led to the basement. His grandfather's diary indicated that the portal to the dark dimension was located deep within the house. The stairs creaked beneath his feet as he descended, taking him to a basement even darker than the rest of the house. The air was cold and damp, and a feeling of oppression hung in the room. Lucas felt as if he were being watched by invisible eyes as he advanced through the basement. He finally arrived at an underground room where the darkness was almost palpable. The flashlight illuminated a strange, ancient structure that resembled a portal. The portal was made up of a series of enigmatic symbols and inscriptions. It seemed to be a passage to another dimension, a source of all the evil that plagued Rua das Sombras. Lucas knew it was time to act. With his grandfather's diary in one hand and the flashlight in the other, Lucas began to recite the words that were written in the diary. The symbols on the portal began to glow ominously, as if they were responding to his grandfather's words. The portal shook and shook, as if it was struggling to resist. The shadows around Lucas stirred and seemed to be gathering around the portal. He felt an oppressive pressure on his shoulders, as if evil itself was trying to stop him. Lucas continued to recite the words from the diary with determination. The portal gave one last groan and finally closed, sealing the darkness that had afflicted the Street of Shadows for so long. Silence fell over the basement, and the shadows slowly receded. Lucas looked around, feeling a mix of relief and triumph. He had managed to fulfill his grandfather's mission and seal the dark portal. Upon leaving the basement and returning to the street, Lucas could see that something had changed. The darkness that once shrouded the Street of Shadows had thinned, and the broken streetlights began to emit a dim light. The ominous atmosphere that had previously dominated the place was dissipating. Lucas knew his work wasn't complete, but he had taken an important step toward helping his grandfather and the tormented souls of Shadow Street. Now, he had the responsibility of finding his grandfather and making sure the shadows didn't return. He returned to the house where he had found the diary and began searching the place for clues as to his grandfather's whereabouts. However, the diary contained limited information about the portal's exact location, and Lucas found himself faced with a new challenge. As he continued his search, Lucas noticed a room he had not yet explored. It appeared to be the main room in the house, and was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. As he surveyed the room, his eyes fell on a portrait on the wall. It was an old painting of his grandfather, from a time when he was a young guardian of the Street of Shadows. The portrait's gaze seemed to follow Lucas, as if it were trying to convey a message. Lucas approached the portrait and touched the image of his grandfather. It was then that he noticed that the portrait was hanging in front of a small secret passage. Carefully, he pushed the portrait aside, revealing a hidden door behind it. The secret door led him to a narrow hallway that led him to a room hidden in the recesses of the house. In the bedroom, Lucas found a dusty trunk that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. With shaking hands, he opened the trunk and found a set of old letters and documents. As he read the letters, he realized that his grandfather had communicated with others who had knowledge about the Street of Shadows. The letters spoke of a secret society that had dedicated itself to keeping the street's secrets safe from the world. Lucas knew he needed to contact this society and get help finding his grandfather. He had a mission to fulfill and was willing to face supernatural challenges to ensure that the Street of Shadows would never be a cursed place again. With his grandfather's diary in one hand and letters in the other, Lucas prepared to leave the house and begin his journey in search of the secret society. He was determined to unravel the mystery of Rua das Sombras and bring peace to the tormented souls who inhabited the dark place.